It is to the boys who were my friends for so long. My one regret of the war is that I was not with them when it ended. For the companionship of 2.5 years of death and misery is a spouse that tolerates no divorce. Such companionship finally becomes a part of one's soul, and it cannot be obliterated. The experience with Ernie Pyle was about you. He was genuinely interested. He wanted to hear that story. He wanted to tell it well and honestly so that you could connect with people that you had never seen. His early career, before he started as a war correspondent, he was a journalist, actually wound up as the managing editor for the Washington Daily Times. At a certain point, he got tired of being stuck in the office, and he managed to sell them on the idea of being a roving reporter. And so he and his wife would pack up the car, and in exchange for 6 columns a week at about 1,000 words a column, they traveled the country. He was always committed to telling the story of ordinary people living ordinary lives, and it really gave him a chance to exercise just telling a story really beautifully and simply and connecting people of all different types and all across the country. And as the war was starting and as they were both getting older, they decided they needed a home base. They decided on Albuquerque and built this house. If you look at the house, especially in the context of the neighboring houses, it's a little Midwestern house with a white picket fence that is clapped in this southwestern city. But it was a way for him to connect his Albuquerque home with his Dana, Indiana roots, which were very important to him. They moved into the house in 1940. He was dead by the end of April 1945, and Jerry died in November of that year. It was her heirs who made the decision to give the house to the city of Albuquerque, and it opened as a library in October 1948. When he got into the European theater, and he was kind of the prototype for the embedded reporter, although I think he did it better than anybody's done since. He was there. He was in the foxholes. He was getting bitten by insects. Going through the manuscripts of some of the columns that were published either right before or right after his death, he's talking about running into a soldier from Albuquerque, and their main connection was that they both had their eyes swollen shut because of the mosquito bites. My favorite writing turns up at the end of Here Is Our War. The end was not in sight. They had wrapped up this African campaign successfully, but they didn't know what was next, and they didn't know where to go, and they had left so many behind. He ends with a passage about all you can do as you walk past the crosses is stop and murmur, "Thanks, pal." He understood the hardship and the loneliness. He had an extremely strong sense of fairness. I just wonder, looking at it from this 21st century perspective, what it meant to the people at home. You were in Tennessee and your brother was in the infantry after D-Day, and here was this column that this journalist had written, and he named your brother, and he told a story about your family that had always made you laugh. And the distance in World War II is very different than the distance in our contemporary wars. And I think he closed that distance, but part of closing that distance was making sure that people understood exactly what that war on the ground was like. He was very connected to what human beings need. One of the more famous works that appears in a lot of the collections is on the death of Captain Wasco. It's quoted on the monument in the back of the library. It's a beautiful piece of writing. It's a very simply told story of a man that people cared about who died doing his duty. The passage itself, just one of those enduringly powerful, what is the cost of war? He shot from being a respected columnist during peacetime with a good book or two under his belt and a lot of name recognition, to being, in some ways, an international celebrity. He won the Pulitzer. People listened to him. He was able to leverage that. And so the Ernie Pyle bill that got his soldiers commensurate raise, that was an amazing piece of advocacy. One of the things that, growing up in Albuquerque in New Mexico, the Navajo Code Talkers are one of our great stories of the war. And there's a column that, again, was published posthumously, and I don't know if it was redacted or not. But the typescript that we have, he said, "Oh, I ran into Sergeant Joe Gatewood and his brother. They're Navajos, and we had, in Europe, the Navajos were giving coded transmissions because when they're speaking their own language, only one Navajo will understand another. These guys are doing the same thing out here. That was classified. So whether it actually made it into print at that point or not, I would have to check. That was the kind of access he had. And he had a connection with the sergeant he was talking to who had gone to the Indian school in Albuquerque. And so, they knew the same city. There's a piece where he's talking about the B-29 pilots in the Pacific Theater. They would fly, come back to the ship or the island or wherever they were based, and it was all sack time. The flying took so much out of them that pretty much between missions it was all downtime and all recovery. And he talks about how, what the pilots really need is a quota, some hope of when they're going to be done. And some of them had come from the European front to do this in the Pacific. And just that sense of, they needed to have an end in sight. And Washington wasn't putting those kind of numbers up. It was another one of those really powerful pieces of advocacy that this is what these guys need, that they're not getting. His death, it was tragic, but it was a soldier's death. He was killed by sniper fire on Ieshima, Japan, the 17th of April, 1945. It was very, very risky to recover his body. The soldier got permission to go under heavy fire to attempt the recovery and was able to bring him back. They found the last column that he was working on. It's, in pencil, in his handwriting. He's actually been buried twice, sharing a grave with the other casualties from Ieshima, and then was reburied at the National Cemetery on Okinawa. And the soldiers themselves raised a monument for him on Okinawa. One of his living memorials is this house here in Albuquerque, which I think is fitting because even in the war correspondence, he was all about ordinary people living ordinary lives. His death and his Purple Heart both signal the solidarity with the soldiers, because not many civilians earn a Purple Heart. So many people were sending condolences to his wife, Jerry. Roosevelt had died very shortly before Pyle's death, and Truman had just assumed the presidency. And there's this really touching thing from a lady who said, "I loved our president, but I really, really loved your husband, and I'm so sorry that he's gone." The neighbors would come by, and people who were passing through who knew he had lived in Albuquerque would come by. And during the time, between his death and Jerry's, they would come, and there was a nurse who was taking care of Jerry. And they would come and they would ask for an autograph. And she kept a toffee box with the signatures cut off of canceled checks. And she would give those to people who wanted that little piece of memory. He made it look easy. And if you've done any kind of writing, what he did was not easy. And he made it look very natural. And I think, he worked hard. And it took a lot of courage to do what he did, and he would never have said that about himself. Don't think we have any contemporary comparisons to Ernie Pyle. And I don't know if it's that warfare and the way we report it have changed so much, or if it's just that he had that remarkable combination of the human touch and the extraordinary writing skills. He had the kind of credibility that the generals had to acknowledge. They couldn't ignore the common soldier. That story was out there. It totally unglamorized the war. It was a do-or-die time, and it was an important war to win. That lasting legacy of telling the story in a way people could connect with and remember humanized the people who were fighting the war, forced the politicians who might have wanted to move very quickly on to other things. They had it in black and white from somebody that people trusted in ways that they didn't trust the generals and they didn't trust the politicians. He remained a force to be reckoned with. These are the things that you at home need not even try to understand. To you at home, they are columns of figures, or he is a near one who went away and just didn't come back. You didn't see him, lying so grotesque and pasty beside the gravel road in France. We saw him by the multiple thousands. That's the difference.